Picture this. November of 1937, a small Japanese town called Koromo, a smoke-filled tavern next to a workshop, a man of 44 sitting at a wooden table, staring at a wooden model of a car the size of a fist. Next to him, a cup of bitter tea, a pencil chewed on one end, and a scrap of paper on which three words are written in Japanese: "Go and see." That's it. No business plan, no sales projections, no investors. In a country where there are fewer than 2 automobiles per 1,000 people, this man has just spent every yen his family built on his father's looms to open a factory that will produce cars. Cars that nobody is buying, in a country that is about to enter a war. If at that moment someone had walked up to him and said that exactly 70 years later, the company he is building from nothing in this tiny town will overtake General Motors and become the largest automaker on the planet, Kiichiro Toyoda would have politely nodded and gone back to his wooden model, because he knew something they didn't know in Detroit. He knew one quiet rule, and that rule, given enough time, would silently destroy the American auto industry. To understand where that rule came from, you have to go back another 30 years. Kiichiro was born in 1894 in a village near Nagoya, into the family of a man named Sakichi Toyoda. Sakichi was what the Japanese call, with deep respect, a craftsman from God. An ordinary carpenter's son, with no formal education. At the age of 11, he watched his mother weave cotton on a wooden loom until her hands bled. And he said to himself, "I will make sure she never has to do this again." And he did. Sakichi invented an automatic loom that would stop itself the instant a thread broke. Sounds simple? It was a revolution. Before that, one worker could tend one loom, and the thread still snapped. The fabric still came out defective. Money still vanished into waste. Sakichi's invention allowed a single woman to operate 30 looms at once. In 1929, the British company Platt Brothers, the largest manufacturer of textile machinery in the world, paid Sakichi 100,000 pounds sterling for the patent. In today's money, that's roughly $8 million. Sakichi took that check, laid it in front of his son Kiichiro, and said one sentence that would define the rest of the 20th century. "I have done my part. Go into automobiles. That is the future." And then he added something Kiichiro would never forget. Don't copy, invent. And here is where it gets interesting. Because most sons of wealthy industrialists in that situation do one of two things. Either they take the father's money and live off the interest, or they take the father's money and invest it in something familiar, something safe, something close to what already works. Kiichiro did a third thing. He took those pounds sterling and got on a steamship to Europe and America. Not for a month, for a year. He toured the Citroën plants in France. He walked the workshops of Daimler-Benz in Germany. And then, this is the moment that matters, he arrived in Detroit, at Ford, at River Rouge, the largest industrial complex on the planet at that time. Picture the scene. 1929, 130,000 workers on the Ford grounds, a new automobile rolling off the line every minute, skyscrapers being built in Detroit on the money that one single industry generates. And next to all of that power stands a small, silent Japanese man in a wet coat, a little notebook in his hand. And this man is not writing down output figures. He's not writing down cost per unit. He is writing down the things Americans look at every day and don't see. He is writing down waste. How many times a worker bends down for nothing? How many seconds a part lies on the floor with no purpose? How many defective sub-assemblies quietly continue down the line? Because stopping the line means losses, and fixing it later seems cheaper. How much steel is going into shavings? How long passes between the moment a part is made and the moment it is needed? Kiichiro walks out of Ford with a notebook full of tiny details. And it is in this notebook, in these details, that the thing the world will later call the Toyota production system is born, the most copied and least understood manufacturing philosophy in human history. But back then, in 1937, when he came home and opened an automobile division inside his father's loom company, no one even said the word Toyota with a straight face. The first cars Kiichiro produced, the Model AA, vaguely resembling a Chrysler Airflow with a clipped nose, sold poorly. The quality was awful. Engines stalled. Headlights burned out. One Japanese dealer in 1939 said a sentence that became legendary: "I would sooner sell water to a river than sell these cars." And then the war began. Toyota was forced to switch to producing trucks for the Japanese army. Factories were bombed, raw materials disappeared, workers went hungry. In 1945, when American occupation forces entered Japan, Kiichiro stood in front of the ruins and thought one thing: "My father told me not to copy, but if there's nothing left to copy, no cars, no money, nothing but ruins, what then?" And here, in that emptiness, he made the most important decision of his life. He decided not to start with cars. He decided to start with thinking. In 1949, Toyota stood on the edge of bankruptcy. Japan was still in ruins, inflation was raging, banks refused to extend credit. To save the company, Kiichiro was forced to do something almost unthinkable for a Japanese executive of that era: lay off 2,000 workers. In a culture of lifetime employment, that was close to betrayal. The workers went on strike. And then Kiichiro did something extraordinary. He didn't sit in his office. He didn't fight through lawyers. He went to the workers, bowed deeply, and took the blame on himself. And then he did something no one expected. He resigned the presidency of his own company, voluntarily. 2 years later, he was dead. He was 57. And here, in our story, a new man enters. The one who turned Kiichiro's notebook scribbles into an actual system. His name was Taiichi Ono, and he, though his name appears on no logo, is the true architect of the thing that will destroy Detroit. Ono came to Toyota from the loom division. He had never built an automobile in his life. That, it turned out, was his greatest advantage. Because when they put you in charge of a factory floor and tell you, "Make cars the way Ford makes them," and you have never seen how Ford does it, you are forced to invent everything from scratch. And Ono started with one simple observation. He went to an American supermarket. Yes, a supermarket. He stood in the aisles of a Piggly Wiggly in Seattle and watched how a shelf works. Someone takes a bottle of milk. The clerk immediately puts a new one back. Not 10 bottles in reserve, not 100. One. Exactly one. As many as were taken. As many as were needed. In that moment, something flipped inside his head. He returned to Japan and said the sentence that would become the foundation of the entire system: "Produce only what is needed, only when it is needed, and only in the quantity that is needed." They called it just in time. Sounds like a logistics cliche, but if you really think about it, it was a complete inversion of how factories had been built for half a century. Ford produced cars in batches of 1,000, kept mountains of parts in warehouses, shut down lines because of imbalance. Toyota decided to make one car at a time, and every part appeared exactly when it was needed on the line. Not a second earlier, not a second later. And here is where the quiet rule of Kaizen begins to do its work. The word Kaizen translates literally as change for the better. But in that simple translation hides a depth that the West would not understand even 70 years later. In the West, people think, to make something better, you have to tear it all down and rebuild from scratch. A great reform, an innovation, a revolution. The Japanese think differently. The Japanese think, to make something better, you improve one small thing today, tomorrow you improve another small thing, the day after another, and you do this for 30 years straight. And in that, everything. That is the quiet rule that destroyed Detroit. Not a brilliant invention, not a breakthrough, but the patience to make one tiny thing better every single day for decades. While your competitors wait for the great leap, you simply walk forward. Small steps, every day, without stopping. And 20 years later, it turns out the distance between you and them is impossible to close. If you find it interesting how systems like this actually work, how a single idea, repeated 1,000,000 times, rebuilds an entire industry, subscribe to the channel. This is exactly what we explore here. Not the wins of lone geniuses, but the quiet patterns that turn the world upside down. Hit like if this story has already pulled you in. That's the biggest support you can give to stories like this one. And now, back to Taiichi Ono and his most extraordinary move. Because Ono did one more thing that, in Detroit, would have been unthinkable. He attached a cord to the assembly line, an ordinary yellow cord that ran the length of the entire production line. This cord was called the andon, and here was the revolutionary part. Any worker, even the lowest ranked one, who had only joined the factory yesterday, had the right and the obligation to pull that cord if he noticed even the smallest defect. And when he pulled it, the entire line stopped. 2,000 people stopped working. In Detroit, you would have been fired on the spot for that and sued for damages. At Toyota, you were thanked for it. More than that, Ono himself would come to the worker bow and ask, "Why did this happen? What are we doing wrong as a system?" Not why did you mess up, but why did the system allow this? It was a complete inversion of how authority on a factory floor worked. In Detroit, the worker was guilty. At Toyota, the system was guilty. And it was precisely this small shift in perspective that led 30 years later to a Japanese car having roughly 5 times fewer defects per vehicle than an American one. 5 times. That isn't marketing. That is the math accumulated by millions of pulls of a yellow cord. Alongside this, Ono invented one more thing that seems almost laughable against the giant computerized planning systems of that era. A card, an ordinary paper card the size of your palm. They called it kanban, which in Japanese simply means signboard. On the card was written which part, how many, where to take it. When the parts ran out, the card was sent back to the previous workshop as an order for a new batch. And only then did that workshop start producing. No computers, no complex algorithms, paper, pencil, common sense. At the very same time, General Motors was spending hundreds of millions of dollars on the latest IBM mainframes for production planning, and still had warehouses stuffed with parts no one needed. Toyota with paper slips outran GM with mainframes. Because the point was never the technology, the point was the philosophy. If you want to see how deep this philosophy went, look at the 5 whys rule. When something failed at Toyota, anything from a broken machine to a mistake on the line, the engineer had to ask why 5 times in a row. The first why gave a surface answer. The second why dug deeper. The third reached a structural cause. The fourth uncovered a systemic flaw. The fifth opened up the root that no one ever bothered to reach. A real example: a machine stopped working. Why? A fuse blew. Why? Because the motor overheated. Why? Because the bearing wasn't being lubricated. Why? Because the oil pump wasn't pumping enough oil. Why? Because the pump's filter was being clogged with metal shavings that nobody was cleaning. Do you see the difference? If you stop at the first why, you just replace the fuse, and tomorrow it blows again. If you reach the fifth, you redesign the entire maintenance system and never have that problem again. In Detroit, almost everyone stopped at the first why. No time. The line has to keep moving. That's somebody else's problem. At Toyota, the 5 whys became a religion. And then, the thing the Americans would understand last of all, when the oil crisis hit in 1973, the price of gasoline in the United States exploded within weeks. Big American cars with 7-liter engines suddenly became nobody's friend. People stood in line for 3 hours to fill up. And right at that moment, into the American market walked a small, cheap, reliable, fuel-efficient Toyota Corolla. People bought it not because it was beautiful. They bought it because it went twice as far on a single tank as a Cadillac. And it didn't break down. By 1980, Toyota had overtaken Volkswagen and become the largest foreign automaker in the United States. Detroit chuckled. "Japanese tin cans," Ford and General Motors executives said. "It's a fad. A couple of years from now, people will go back to buying real cars." It didn't pass. By the 90s, Toyota was building a car in 17 hours of labor. General Motors was spending 31 hours on the same vehicle, 14 hours of difference. Multiply that by 5 million cars a year. That's 70 million man-hours of savings every single year. In labor cost terms, that's roughly $3 billion a year of pure advantage. While Detroit was paying out bonuses to top executives, Toyota was investing those $3 billion in new factories, in new research. In the Prius hybrid that came out in 1997, when oil was dirt cheap and everyone laughed, "Why would you bother with this redundant technology?" They laughed right up until Tesla appeared, and then they stopped laughing. because it turned out that throughout the 80s, 90s, and 2000s, Toyota had been quietly investing in what we now call electrification technologies. And while Detroit was fighting for survival, the Japanese were already on the next chessboard. That is the long game. That is what Detroit never understood. Not one decision, not one trend, but 30 years of consistency where every quarter you walk in the same direction and you don't look at who is writing what about you. But you have to be honest, because this story is not about saints. The same mechanism that made Toyota the best, respect for the worker, endless improvement, refusal to compromise, in its shadow side produced something dark. In the 90s and 2000s, a word appeared in Japan that gives you chills: karoshi, death from overwork. Engineers at Toyota and its affiliated companies, who literally would not leave the factory for weeks, who slept under their desks, who didn't see their families, sometimes died of heart attacks at their desks at 38. One of the most famous cases is an engineer named Kenichi Uchino, who died of a heart attack at the age of 30 after working 114 hours of overtime in a single month. 114 hours. That's almost 3 full work weeks on top. His wife sued the company and won. But that doesn't bring the man back. And this too is part of the system. Because when you put Kaizen at the center of a culture, when constant improvement becomes not a method, but an obligation, you create an environment in which a person stops being a person and becomes a function of the process. That has to be said. It does not diminish the greatness of what Kiichiro built, but it shows that no system, no matter how perfect, exists for free. Somewhere, someone is always paying the bill. And one more shadow: the pressure on suppliers. For decades, Toyota built a system in which its small parts suppliers lived right at the edge of profitability. The very structure of the relationship was designed so that the supplier could never walk away. They were tied by contracts, by technologies, by logistics. And every year, Toyota would ask for a price reduction. Not 20%, 1.5%, 2%. Small numbers. Kaizen in action. But after 20 years, many suppliers had no margin left for anything. No margin to upgrade equipment, no margin for decent wages for their own workers. And then, in 2009 and 2010, the sticking gas pedal scandal exploded. Toyota recalled almost 9 million vehicles around the world. At least 37 people died. And when they began to investigate, it turned out the pedals were made by a small supplier who, for about 10 years, had been cutting back on testing because economically there was no other way to survive. Toyota apologized publicly. But the question hung in the air: can a system built on the endless squeezing of suppliers eventually become dangerous to itself? And here, let's do one more thing. Before we wrap up, write in the comments: could you, like Toyota, stop an entire assembly line for one tiny defect? Could you spend $3 billion on improvements whose results only your grandchildren will see? Because in that question lies the heart of the entire story. And when you look at the modern world today, at electric cars, at artificial intelligence, at autonomous driving, it almost looks like Toyota is finally falling behind. Tesla has overtaken it in market capitalization. Chinese BYD is producing electric vehicles at a scale the Japanese could once only dream of. In Detroit, people are talking about a renaissance again. And it seems like the story is over, that the era of Japanese dominance is in the past. But if you look closely, you notice one strange thing. Toyota is not panicking. Its president, Akio Toyoda, the grandson of that same Kiichiro, said something in 2023 that everyone noticed. The electric vehicle is just one of 17 possible roads. It's not wise to bet everything on one of them. Investors didn't get it. Analysts criticized. And Toyota quietly continued developing hydrogen engines, hybrids, solid-state batteries, and a full palette of alternatives, because its strategy hasn't changed in 100 years. Don't try to predict the future. Prepare for every possible future. That is the long game. That is the quiet rule of Kaizen, applied not to one part on an assembly line, but to an entire civilizational bet. And when you look at this whole story together, from the boy watching his father by the loom to a global empire that produces one automobile every 4 seconds, you start to notice one thing. There are no brilliant individual decisions in it, no breakthroughs, no single right move. There are a million small right moves made one after another over a century by people whose names no one remembers, but whose yellow cords and paper cards quietly rewrote the rules of the most powerful industry of the 20th century. Kiichiro never saw what his company became. He died in 1952 when Toyota was producing fewer than 2,000 cars a month. 70 years later, it produces over 10 million cars a year. Kiichiro will never know that his quiet rule, Kaizen, respect for the worker, the long game, observation instead of assumption, became an academic discipline taught at Harvard, Stanford, and MIT. That his loom, the one that stopped itself on a defective thread, became the prototype for how iPhone production lines work today. That his father's sentence, "Don't copy, invent," became the unspoken creed of Silicon Valley. And here we are left with the question I want to leave with you. Looking at the 21st century, at the speed with which everything collapses and changes, at the illusion that one big leap will solve all our problems, at the cult of the heroic founder who reshapes the world in a single year, have we lost the main thing? Are we still capable of the long game? Are we still capable of walking 30 years in the same direction, in small steps, without recognition, without applause, without likes? Do we still have the patience for the quiet rule? Because if we look truth in the face, the biggest things in the world are not built by an explosion. They are built by a drop. And someone right now, this very minute, in some town no one has ever heard of, maybe in Ukraine, maybe in Vietnam, maybe in Kenya, is standing next to something small that no one notices and making it a little better. And tomorrow they will make it a little better still, and the day after. And in 30 years, when we are all reading in astonishment about the new empire that came from nowhere, that will be the answer to the question Kiichiro Toyoda asked himself in rainy Detroit in 1929. And we didn't notice, the same way we didn't notice then.